We got a little history on the festival and stuff like that. We gotta burn something.
Hi, this is Mike Hittner, Historic Point Basse Update, and welcome all our viewers out there in TV land. And on my right is Don Matthews. Welcome, Don.
Thank you.
Don has been here once or twice before, and Don and I are going to talk a little bit today about our Spirit Walk, which we're in between weeks of it. We've had our first week on the 17th, and the next one will be this coming Saturday, the 24th. And then we're going to talk about some building projects and a few other things like that. But Don's got a little something different on today, and we want to talk a little bit about that, or have Don talk about that. He's wearing a hat, a little different hat. Looks like almost like a stocking cap, but really isn't. Don, will you explain a little bit about the value and the use of that type of hat?
Most people, when they initially see this, think that, why do you have a sleeping hat on? Because they relate it to an old-fashioned sleeping hat. But in our time period, and probably into the early 1900s, many people would wear their dress clothes even to work. And they would take, like in my case, I would take my good hat off, or my wide brim hat, because it's very difficult to work in the shop with this wide brim hat. But you didn't want to have your head uncovered, because I think this is an assumption on my part, but I think it could be either a social thing, but I think maybe it might have been a hygiene thing, where you don't want the dirt from your work to get into your hair, and
I think for the TV audience, that Don works in the carpenter shop most of the time, and of course there's shavings and stuff flying around in the air, and I think hygiene wasn't, like Don said, it wasn't the same as it is today. I don't think everybody took a shower every couple of days. They didn't have showers as we know of them, and baths, as the season got colder, they became less often. So I think to keep your hair clean and this sort of thing, I think it's one of the reasons, I think, Don, that they wore them.
Yes. So we'd come to the shop and we'd put our apron on to protect our clothes, and take our good hat off, or the hat that would probably cause us some issues working in the shop, and put the skull cap on. And I'm not sure if it could have been an outgrowth of the skull cap, but I think it was mainly just something to cover, just like the maids would have a cover on their hair, and it was fairly typical of the age to always have your head covered.
And I think you had touched a little bit on it, Don, that the social mores were such that men didn't unbutton their sleeves and roll them up, even if they were working in the field. It wasn't socially acceptable. For those days, you kept your body pretty well always covered, and that's why you see on some historic sites, you see two sets of steps, like going up into a public building. One set is got more steps, and they're lower steps. The other side is higher steps. The higher steps are for the men, and the lower steps are for the women. Well, the women weren't supposed to show their ankle or anything. They were supposed to go up. More steps were put in, on that side. So they took more steps, but they showed less ankle and that sort of thing. It was just the mores of the day. And I think the hat, besides the cleanliness and to preserve your good hat, was also maybe one of the mores, just like we didn't roll up our sleeves even if we're working in the fields and that sort of thing. It was, it's a different era. It's harder to understand just because we've had 150 years of change since then, and you have to almost read about it to get the feel for it. Just like a lot of times we talk about, well, why did the Wakeleys come here? Well, in 1836 there was a major depression, so a lot of these people were forced by economic situations to move, just like we have these different refugees in these different countries leaving Syria and Africa, going to Europe for better standards and everything. And I think it was that version of it, not maybe as extreme certainly, but a version of that sort of thing that was taking place.
But history is always so interesting, isn't
it? Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
And as Don and I would probably say, and I know Tom and I have always said, that we learned more about history probably in the last 25 years than we learned in school, probably. Unfortunately, we weren't keen on it always at school like we should have been. But living history that we portray down at Historic Point Basse is always much easier. We notice even with the school kids that come in, one of the reasons Don is in today is we want to talk about some things that Don's more familiar with, but Tom isn't in today because we have school groups down at the site, and we're always surprised that these school kids come to the site and we think, are they learning anything? You know, these little second graders or whatever, and then in the summer they come back and they're pulling Grandma and Grandpa by the arm and saying they're telling all the things we taught them. They remembered it and they're telling Grandma and Grandpa all about it. So I mean, it's kind of a marvelous form of learning that they don't actually even know or realize they're learning, but they are learning. So a little bit about our Spirit Walk, which was just happened on the 17th. The next one will be on 24th of Saturday. You'll probably maybe see this just the day before or something, or the day of the next Spirit Walk. But one of our fun activities for, I think, most of our citizens, I think we really enjoy it. We have a lot of help from community theater people that help us out, and so it's kind of a mix of community theater, Point Basse citizens, and even a few others that are on our organizational front, but they only come in once or twice a year to help. And Don did something unique this year. We're not going to tell you totally about it, but he plays a disgruntled farmer, I guess I would say.
Yeah.
And he's got a scarecrow behind him that becomes somewhat animated later on in the sequence. But you want to go through a little bit, Don, your interpretation? And of course, when we're talking about our interpretation, both Don and I play a character in our Spirit Walk. We can only talk about it from our perspective because we really don't see anything else. We're so tied up in our own our little vignette that we don't have time to see the other people and what they're doing. We know what they're doing, but we don't actually get a chance to see them, since especially Don and I are the last two stops.
Yes, we are truly fortunate to have some help from the community theater. I am also a part of that, but more of a minor character in that organization. But Mike Engren is a playwright that has recently written a number of skits for the Spirit Walk, and it really has, I think, heightened the anticipation of people coming to the Spirit Walk, and the interaction and opportunity for us to portray different things in the Spirit Walk.
I think for us, Don, it added a quote unquote a little more professionalism to us. I think we've always done as good a job as we can do, but we're certainly amateurs. Mike and Steve Martin have done a lot of acting through community theater over the years, and so they almost got that professionalness compared to a lot of us that only do this as citizens or as once a year in Spirit Walk or something like that.
And of course, Steve Martin, he's one of the more acclaimed actors in the community theater, so he really brings a lot of professional, portrayals and more, I would say, bang, or realism to the characters.
Yeah, my son went through this year's Spirit Walk, and he says that you can tell Mike and Steve are a little more polished at it because they engage the audience a little bit more. Mm-hmm. Where tendency is, depending on what we're portraying or what we're doing, we have a tendency to lay it out there, but those guys actually engage the people a little bit more.
Yes. That's a very difficult thing in acting. There's a term called the fourth wall or fourth curtain that typically actors are not supposed to cross. That is interaction with audience, and mainly that is because it's so difficult to pull back from that once you do it, and then still, remain in character. So it's probably best left to people that have more experience.
Yes, yeah.
And but anyway, I really enjoyed the skit that he wrote for myself and another actor, Jim or Bill. Mm-hmm. And the reaction last week to people, they had and that gives us some feedback and some sense of accomplishment when we can get some oohs and ahs and maybe
shriek or two.
Shriek or two would be even better. Yeah. And so we had some of those and got some good feedback from that. I think you'll enjoy it. It's about a farmer who is down on his luck and kind of probably complaining a little bit, and some unusual things happen that probably make him grateful for just being alive.
Yes.
Yes. So,
And-
but it also portrays many of the struggles of a farmer in that era. It was very hard to grow crops, and I'm an avid gardener, but I would hate to depend on my survival for my gardening skills and the crops that I grow.
Yeah,
And these people had to.
Yeah, these were subsistence farmers, basically. Whatever they could grow, there was no stores to go to, is what they got to eat. They could hunt it, fish it, trade for it, grow it, or raise it, and that was the way they survived. And the tendency is that maybe you could survive it in the fall pretty good because the crop or the harvest, whatever harvest they got, came in. But by spring, the larder was getting pretty thin, and by that time they were waiting for that first asparagus and some of those early things that they could start eating something fresh again, and probably they were running low on a lot of things. So
it's a very appropriate skit. So that's I was very impressed with it because it really matches the theme of the site.
yes, yes. And I did a letter in the house that was written to my children by Robert Wakely, and I portray Robert Wakely at this time, and it was just to his children about the death of his wife and their mother. So it's kind of a sad one. Usually we mix them up. We don't have like, three sad ones in a row or three real, potent ones in a row. We have a little mix a little comedy or a little laughter in between, which kind of breaks it up, because if you got three of those in a row, I think it'd be kind of a downer after a while. And most all the stories that we do down there and are either true stories in regards to the letter that is an actual letter that Robert Wakely wrote to his children, or they are things that would have happened at the time or happened about the same time and just changed some names or something like that. In the case of what Mike Edgren wrote up for Don and Bill, it was compared. Actually, Mike and Steve are really good at this. They kind of go back in history to find out just how things were, and so when they write something, it's written fairly close historically to what was going on, which is the beauty of it. I mean, it takes a lot of research. I mean, it isn't something that I think they think up the plot in their minds, but then they have to fill it in, and they have to make sure it's historically at least could be possible.
Right.
Yeah. So that was good. So if any of you haven't come out to the Spirit Walk, it was very successful. We had about 12 groups that went around. I kind of lost count after 6 or 7, but I understood there was 12, and about 12 or 15 in a group, and it was a very good night. Weather was a little cool. Don and Mike and Steve and Bill and I think Jim Nickel were outside, and the trolls were outside, but the rest of us were inside buildings that either provided some protection or some heat, depending on where you were. But you guys weren't too cold, were you? You had a little fire.
We had a bonfire. We had to have a fairly good bonfire. That's my excuse.
Yes.
To see the actions of the scarecrow.
That's kind of like lights for you, so
Yes.
that's their natural lighting. But of course, the audience, of course, we will dress appropriately. We always suggest you dress appropriately depending on the weather, so that it takes about 45 minutes to go around the site. We have 8 stops, or 9 stops depending, and about 45 minutes, so dress appropriately for it. And sometimes you can't start out right away because there's backed up a couple groups, and they send them out about every 10 minutes, and that would be, good to dress appropriately.
Yeah, that's a very good point. At the start also, in the years past, I've worked more at the start being a storyteller. And one thing that's happened, like last year, maybe a little bit the year before, I started asking people whether they would like stories, like Indian stories, or this, I try to do this Legend of Sleepy Hollow. But I started asking them would they prefer to know more about Point Basse, and it was very surprising that probably 50% or more said, yes, we'd really like to know more about Point Basse. So if you will be entertained even while you're waiting, and make sure that if you don't want stories and you want to know more about Point Basse, just tell the storytellers, and they will gladly switch into telling more about your history.
And the guides are pretty good at that too. They usually have little
Yes,
cue
that's a
cards,
good point.
and they will point out things like the Stone Arch Bridge that was a historic is a historic bridge and was on the National and State Registry of Historic Sites, and about the house and when the Wakeleys came and the different buildings on the site. So you'll get a little perspective as you tour around because it'll be a little fill-in in between the different stops that you make. So we think it suggests if you came down, I think you'd enjoy it a lot. We're going to switch gears a little bit. Don and I and about 6 or 8 of our other individuals work on Mondays at our site and building projects or maintenance projects depending on the time of year and what's going on. And Don has been kind of heading up for us a bunkhouse. Now the Wakeleys had a bunkhouse on the site. We know it from pictures and also from historic surveys that there was a bunkhouse, and this bunkhouse was used to house what we would call today migrant workers, people from different areas that came in to help seasonally. So Robert Wakeley had a powder mill, he had a shingle a place where he made shingles, wood shingles and things like that, and he had lots of things going on, and he was in and out all the time. So they had this group of anywhere from 4 to 8 people that came in seasonally to help him, and so we're recreating this bunkhouse on almost the identical location where it was located. And so, Don, you want to go through some of the specifics of the bunkhouse, how we started with the piers, and go through that?
Yes, probably what we're striving for is an authentic building that is probably strong, more soundly constructed than a building of that type, yet still looks authentic. So many times in the past they would just build them on stones laid on the ground, but we went into mixing our own concrete to put concrete piers into the ground, but then make them look like they're old and from a more of a hand mixed concrete. And we did mix it with a machine, but it was all shoveled in. It was, and
Yeah.
so that's one thing that we're trying to anchor the building in more solidly so it lasts longer. And then we attempted to portray the same construction as the house, which has a 8x8 beam around the perimeter, and then the joists into that, and then the walls up from there. Now the outside will be just siding. The inside will be bare studs, typically of that character of that.
And especially for a building that was used seasonally, probably more than anything. So
Yes.
they didn't need to have. And in those days, folks, they didn't have insulation. Newspapers, if you're lucky, that was about it to cut the wind down, I suppose, or something like that. But they would have maybe had it, as the house is, plastered inside, or at least a board in the inside. But since this is seasonal, we're just going to put a siding on the outside, and that'll suffice for inside and outside. And you'll see bare studs on the inside.
It will be more in the line of the Wakeley house. It's going to be kind of like a simple Greek revival style. Obviously, they wouldn't have spent as much time as they would have on the house. So we're trying to step lightly. I suppose that's not the correct words, but we're trying to walk a thin line to where we have a building that will last and be strong, and then also not look too haphazard or like logs.
Right.
It would be one that was built with I don't know, a little bit more modern technology.
Right.
But not to the
In the modern technology we're talking about is that
solid lumber.
we got sawed lumber. The beams are anchored into the concrete. In those days, they would have probably just set it on stones. In fact, we have some of the original stones that the building was placed on, the original bunkhouse. and we'll use those around the site as kind of a fill-in underneath the building to kind of take up that foot of space or so we don't get too many hibernating animals under there and that sort of thing. But we're using modern structural techniques in an old-fashioned style, I guess is the best way to say it. We're using all of our stuff is pretty much 16 inches on centers, whether it's the floor or the walls. So we're building it over strength wise, I think, or we're over emphasizing.
That was kind of typical back then.
Was that 16
yes.
inch?
Yes.
And so we're in the process. We've got we took down some big pine trees. Now we're going to have those milled at early November. A portable sawmill will come in. We'll mill those, and that's where we'll get most of our siding. We'll have some extra, 1x and 2x material that we can use. If we don't use it for this project, we'll use it in the future for future projects. But this is one of those projects that really is probably about a year-long project, start to finish, before it gets really totally wrapped up. I think we'll have it. Our plan is, anyway, depending on the weather, is to have the sidewalls up and the roof timbers up, so that we can throw something over the roof of it, and then maybe on a nice winter day when it's sunny and not too cold, we can work and plug away at the project during the winter. But probably by end of March, first part of April, we'll start it at full steam ahead. Probably after we get through the major part of the winter. So it's a fun project. I think that Don has been on board since we worked on the warehouse and kind of headed that project up. And there's a lot of satisfaction when you can look at a pile of materials, and then you look at the finished product and you say, holy cow, that turned out really good. And sometimes when you're in the middle of it, you wonder, is this going to go? And I think it's much more that way when we're dealing with, like we did with the warehouse, with a pre-existing building and trying to modify it into a building that we wanted to use. That's a little harder because you were using logs that were hand-hewn. We had some rods, so we had to lower it about two courses, and so we got a little bit lower door than we would have liked. It's probably a 4'8" or 5' door. But for a warehouse that they're only using occasionally, bringing things in and out of, it's not one of our buildings where people are coming and going most of the time. It's not a major issue. And we whitewashed the inside, so that's done a lot for the inside, brightened it up tremendously.
Yes,
I was surprised how nicely that worked out. And whitewash is one of those things they've been doing for hundreds of years, so it isn't certainly something that it's inappropriate for that sort of thing. So
I have more enjoyment. I think I do enjoy the old, making use of the old parts, but I really enjoy the fact of bringing things from the tree, cutting the tree down and milling it and going in. And we will have quite a few things. We have some of our own trees in the warehouse, and in the bunkhouse we'll have some of wood from the studs and the joists and the rafters and the siding from our own trees on site, and the windows from wood on site too. We'll mill those. That's very satisfying to me.
It's fulfilling, I think. And I think at this time, Don, let's give a little plug for volunteers.
Yes, we've just recently, a couple younger people in their 30s have volunteered, and I just want to take a shout out to people that were kind of thinking possibly about volunteering at Wakely, but maybe they didn't want to be the only people. So this is a good opportunity right now. If you are thinking about being involved in Wakely, there's a couple other young people that might really appreciate some more younger people, middle age, coming on board, and we're all kind of getting in our 60s, and it's like it'd be great to have some people that we could know what might carry it on.
It doesn't matter on what area of volunteerism you want to do, whether you want to help on a special project. Right now we've got a gentleman from Nakusa, Larry Eglin, that helps us, and he only comes around usually when we got a bigger project, and I give him a call, and he's on board for most of that. Whether you want to help with mailings, or you want to be a character, you want to do some telephone calls, you want to help with construction, or just at certain projects, or work the gate, or whatever. We have all different levels of volunteering, and we'd appreciate anybody that'd like to do it. Like Don has mentioned, a number of us are in our 60s or 70s or something like that, and a historic site, at least from the citizens' point of view, should be a mix of ages, because
Yeah.
they had children there, they had young families, they have certainly middle-aged and older people. So we're trying to recreate that mix. So if you want to do that, give a shout out, give a call to me, Mike Hittner, or Tom Bramer, or check our website, or email us, or whatever way or form you'd like to do it. But please think about it. And thank you for Don for being with me this morning, and
Very welcome.
for everybody out there in TV land for watching Historic Point Basse Update. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've got a little history on the festival and stuff like that. We gotta burn some down.